So it's great to see you all here today, and thank you to Maitri for giving me a platform to talk about some of the work that we've been doing and sort of how to kind of connect it to the work that you're interested in about. My 5 ideas come from over 20 years of coalition, networking, campaign work with racialized communities, with workers of color, with low-wage workers, immigrant workers, with women, and with people really struggling with precarious work. And so that's sort of from where I pull my 5 good ideas. And I think it's really important because this topic is a difficult topic in some respects because it means, really trying to grapple with how we make change. And so I just want to say that, the sort of comments that I have to say is critical reflection, not just based on judgment. It's based on my practice. So a lot of the stuff that I'd like to talk to you about, it's not coming from a judgmental perspective. It's coming from practice. It's coming from making a lot of mistakes. It's coming from trying things that fail miserably, trying new things that work, and trying to figure out how do we evaluate, how do we critically look at the work that we do, how do we learn from the mistakes we make, but how do we essentially move forward in our work. As I said, making change, working with communities to try to make a difference in people's lives is very messy. It's not clean. It's challenging. You will be challenged. It's full of angst. But because this is responsible work, right? Like if you are wanting to be accountable, if you're wanting to develop your work that actually has a base, it's going to be messy. And so I just want to say that as part of the overall framework. But the thing is that if you are building that base for effective policy work, even though it's messy, even though it's full of angst, sleepless nights, kind of tearing your hair out at various points, that experience will be shared by many others. You won't be alone. And you'll be doing this work with the communities that are affected and that are standing side by side with you in this struggle. And so I think if you are alone in your public policy work, then that's a real message to you in terms of something needs to change, right? The other thing that I just wanted to say is that I'm going to really try to connect my 5 good ideas with concrete practical examples based on some key campaign work, whether it's the $14 minimum wage campaign, whether it's the work that we've been doing on wage theft, or whether it's the work that we've been doing around temporary agency workers. All of those 3 areas has resulted in legislative change, has resulted in a broader conversation in the public and in the media and with government on those issues. And I really feel that the Workers' Action Center has been a real leader in the past 10 years at forcing that agenda in the forefront of looking at labor conditions in the province and trying to make a change. So I'm not sort of raising these ideas as Ratna said, based on a bunch of theory. It's definitely based on a lot of hard work over the past 12 years, 13 years, and more years on other coalition building work. Okay, so let's get down to it, all right? So, first good idea. Well, I will let you be the judge of whether or not it's a good idea, but it's my idea. The first idea is, I think long-term planning and good research is absolutely critical. I think if you're serious about long-term policy work that is grounded with the communities you're working with, and this is especially important if you're working with communities that are marginalized, that don't traditionally have a voice in the public sphere, or you're working with people who have never had that voice in the public sphere. If you're working with issues where you know there is going to be opposition. For us, of course, you can imagine what our opposition has been to the minimum wage campaign, to changes that we've wanted to make for temp agency workers. We've had the temp industry not very happy about it, right? So if you are really serious about wanting to tackle some of the systemic issues that are about that marginalize people in our communities, that create poverty, then we have to be responsible and we have to be accountable for how we're going to do this work. So planning is critical. More front-loading on the planning is going to mean the longevity of your work and staying power to handle the pushback that you're going to inevitably get, the bumps along the road, the challenges, those folks who don't want to change anything. When we built the base for the temp agency legislation in 2009, when that legislation was being debated, we had started with mass meetings of temp workers back in 2003, 2004, 2005. We had built committees of temp agency workers that went way back, long before we even had a sense of legislation being on the books. So it really means that you have to have staying power in this work, that you can't, I think, have a sense that I think with the current practice that I see sometimes around policy work, I know it's coming from a good place, and I know there's a lot of urgent issues that are sort of at play here, but I see a lot of campaigns developing where, those of us who are concerned about the issues, we're witnessing some problems, then we may be doing a bit of research, we may not do some research, then we get a policy expert, we get a research expert to sort of do the big lay of the land, pull together some solutions, then we maybe have like 1 or 2 meetings to kind of put out those solutions. Does this work for you? Does it not? And then it's a campaign. How is that going to build staying power? How is that going to work with communities to address the bumps that are going to come along the road? A couple of meetings, my friends, does not mean working with your community, right? A couple of meetings to talk about some solutions and to maybe get some feedback is not what I call long-term planning. You have to ensure that you are doing the sufficient prep time and planning that is going to really ground the work that you do. And I'm talking about 1 to 2 years of prep time with the communities. And if you don't have a base of people that you're working with, I would say it has to be a lot longer if you're going to have any sense of integrity with the work that you do. Now, I don't mean 1 or 2 years of endless meetings for meeting's sake. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about real planning. I'm talking about building in action in the process of planning so that people are being engaged, are active. I'm talking about real decision-making and real development of campaign work with leaders from your communities that you have connections with. So what does this mean? So, for example, when we are doing any campaign work for a provincial election, we start that work at least 2 years in advance. So, for instance, when we put together the Ontario Workers Need a Fair Deal campaign that was for the 2007 provincial election, we focused on 3 main areas that workers were dealing with. Enforcement, so not having access to rights that were not enforced in the workplace, the rise of precarious employment, and minimum wage. Those issues we started to work on in early 2006. Okay, so that was like 2 years in advance in terms of conversations with our members. When we were working on the 2011 election, we started that work in early 2010, talking through the process and starting that work with workers in terms of what was it that they were sort of dealing with? What were the sort of policy conversations? Now, I'm going to get into the nitty-gritty of that in my second point, but what I wanted to just talk about is that the process that we kind of engaged in, as opposed to 2006 to the prep we did for the 2011 election, we kind of went back to our members and said, are, those 3 issues, are they still pertinent to what you face and that you want to kind of continue the work? And people said, absolutely. Guess what? Things haven't changed that much. But the 4th issue was immigration. People without status, the rise of migrant work. And so then we added that to the mix. So the four areas. So what I'm talking about, the planning that you do then is where you're able to then pull all these pieces together. And we have to create a planning process that doesn't compartmentalize people's lives. As you can see, these are 4 broad areas: enforcement, precarious employment, minimum wage, and immigration. That means that we are trying to create a framework that comes from good planning. That doesn't mean that you're moving from campaign to campaign. You try something, it doesn't work, then you're saying, okay, we're not seeing any traction on that, so then we're just going to move over here. No, you've got to have a framework that represents people's lives, and that framework is only going to come about from decent planning. So that when something bubbles up out of that framework, you can move on it, but that people understand why it's there in the first place. You're not moving from housing to immigration to income, unless people have actually pulled together that framework. So I think that having a framework and having a decent planning process means that you can be flexible, means that you can also respond to things that are happening. So if something is really moving right now around migrant work, I mean, we've sort of seen what happened yesterday around the McDonald's conversation, around temporary migrant workers. If you have that as part of your framework around dealing with immigration, and you've built the base with your members and with your community, and people have identified that this is something that they want to work on, you can take that up. And it's not a stretch for everyone, right? Because they're there, they've talked about it, they've identified it, they own it, right? It's part of the framework. So the framework and the planning is actually quite critical. And grounded research as part of that planning is also really critical. I'm not talking, again, about a massive paper that not a lot of people are going to read and that are going to sit on a shelf somewhere for a policy expert to pull off when they've got to do a report or an overview of what's going on. I'm talking about a research that connects with your framework. So if your framework has identified 4 key issues, then how do you then base your research on that framework that brings alive the issues that people are facing on the ground? And again, I'm talking about doing surveys that people themselves do. I'm talking about postcards. We had this, for our wage theft campaign, we had a postcard that people went out doing door knocking with 4 or 5 simple questions. Are you facing unpaid wages? Have you not been paid your overtime? Do you have trouble getting paid your public holiday pay? People took that postcard, they did a bunch of door knocking, people filled out the postcard, boom, you could do it in a neighborhood, you can do it in a riding association, and then at the end of the day, you pull the postcards, you filled out 100, you can say, guess what, 75% of the people that we talked to today are experiencing wage theft. So again, simple tools that don't take a lot of time and money, but that are effective, that kind of give voice to the people that you're meeting on a regular basis, that can actually talk about what they're actually facing. And you can use those tools, but it means being active out there in your community and people understanding why they're doing those postcards in the first place. How does it fit with your framework? How does it fit with your policy solutions? So I think research can be an incredible way of building depth to your campaign, building good tools, information that you can then use creatively to prove your point for your public policy solutions. So that's my first idea. The second idea is, I want to get back to the process, the second idea is building the base of support, and real participation is vital for success. So What I want to talk about is the process that we used that built the basis for the wage theft campaign. And that basis for the wage theft campaign has now led to Bill 146, which is right now at Queen's Park, which is going to be taking on some key issues of wage theft, which is now the legislation that's currently on the books right now is about removing the cap that workers face when they file complaints. Right now, if someone files a complaint at the Ministry of Labor, they can only claim $10,000. This legislation will get rid of that cap so you can claim as much as you want. It would mean that a worker doesn't just go back 6 months to claim their wages, they would go back 2 years. And they wouldn't just have 6 months to claim, they wouldn't have a 6-month time limit, but they'd have 2 years to make a complaint. So how did we get that, right? How did we sort of make that alive to sort of get to this point? Well, as I said, we started meeting in early 2010 to again build the base for the November 2011 election campaign. We had small meetings across the city, 2 or 3 members of the Workers' Action Center. We met in coffee shops, we met in malls, we met in people's houses, and basically we just sort of said, we had a conversation. We said, you know what? Here was our campaign that we did last time, the Ontario Workers Need a Fair Deal campaign. What did you think about that? Does that campaign still make sense? Do those 3 issues, the enforcement, precarious work, minimum wage, is that still an issue for you at work? What do you think are the key issues facing you at work right now? Does that still make sense? What's your feedback from the campaign? And we had these tiny meetings, right? Then we worked with 75 people just to have those small meetings, 3 by 3 by 3, because people are busy lives, working all kinds of jobs, all kinds of hours, and so, you know, that's what we did. Then we brought this together, and then we grouped the issues. Then we brought them back to our organizing meetings. We have 2 organizing committees, one downtown and one in Scarborough. And then we said, okay, so this is the information that we've started to get back from those small mini conversations. Does this make sense? Is there anything missing? What are the overall themes? And then had a discussion. Then brought those themes back, grouped them together, brought it back again, and then said, okay, so how do we frame this? What is the language? And people said, you know what? This Ontario Workers Need a Fair Deal kind of slogan, that's not working for us. You know, we didn't really get the kind of change we needed. We got to get a bit hard-hitting here. So we're like, okay, so what are the conversations that are happening in different parts of the world? Now in the US, which is of course, working conditions are a lot more terrible there, there was this movement around wage theft. So then we brought that and we said, okay, so does this make sense? And so we tried it out. We sort of talked about, okay, so if you're not getting paid your wages that you've worked hard for, is that wage theft? People said, absolutely. If you're coming into this country and you're a migrant worker and you're not getting the same wages and legislated rights as other workers, is that wage theft? Absolutely. If you're a temp agency worker and you're getting paid 40% less just because you're hired through a temp agency, is that wage theft? Absolutely. So it made sense. So we said, okay, but you know, this is like a whole new sort of way that we're framing it. Why don't you guys go out there? Let's go talk to our family. Let's go talk to our friends. Let's go talk to our co-workers. Let's see if people really kind of resonate with this whole wage theft conversation. So people went out, we looked at slogans, we looked at ideas. I can't tell you the kind of conversation that we had on the image and coming up with this image and what it would mean. Is it a strong image? Does it reflect, like, how would that be if we went out and we started talking to our co-workers? Does this make sense? Then, while we were doing this, though, while we were having these meetings, we were also, though, people were going out and doing surveys with workers and starting to collect information on wage theft. So as we were pulling together the campaign materials, we were also starting to do that. And so in May 2011, we produced Unpaid Wages, Unprotected Workers. So this was a survey that we did of over 500 folks who then told us about their experience. And we released that in May of 2011. So you can see how you've got to have action components while you're developing the campaign, while you're developing the messaging, and while you're developing the outreach. All the different pieces kind of have to fit together. And then who's going to speak to these issues, right? Who is it going to be me? No, it shouldn't just be me. It should be people who have experienced wage theft. It should be people who haven't been paid their wages, who are being treated like crap because they're a temp agency worker. Why do you want to hear from me? You know, like we got to have, and why just 5 people? Should be 20, should be 30, should be 40 people. Because remember, we're talking about pushback. The pushback that we get is, oh, it's just a few bad apples, Deena. This is not a systemic issue in the labor market. It's just a couple of employers that are just breaking the law. Absolutely not. This is a systemic issue that faces low-wage workers. And so if you're going to go and challenge the kind of stereotypes, the myths, the ways that the way that your communities are undermined constantly about the issues that they face, what are you going to do to prove that they are wrong? It isn't just going to be a nice speech. It's got to be people who are willing to speak up and say, no, this is not just a one bad apple. I have been working as a temp agency worker. I've worked at 10 agencies, and guess what? I have never been paid public holiday pay in every single agency. And it's not just going to be one person. It's got to be 50, right? And 1,000, absolutely. So that's what I'm talking about. And I think it's really critical because I am really sick and tired of campaigns and issues out there where suddenly people decide to do media press conferences and they decide to release a report and they have no connection with the communities that they are supposed to be representing, and there's a mad scramble to try and find a poor person, a worker, a migrant person to speak at that press conference because it's not based in that community, and we have to change the way we do things. By the time you do your campaign, your community should own that campaign. They should know how to speak to it. They should feel a part of it. They should know what's going to happen. They should know the rollout. They should be involved in every single meeting. They should be grounded in that campaign. And if they're not, then you are not going to be prepared to deal with the bumps and the challenges and the issues that come along the way. So let's move away from tokenistic representation, and let's move away from this kind of, fly-by-night campaign policy development and tokenistic kind of feedback and participation by our communities, and let's have some depth to it. I think that would be good. The third thing that I'd like to talk about is we need to ensure that this policy work has small victories along the way that will lead to the bigger change that our communities want. You cannot set people up and say, we are going to revolutionize the labor law reform. We're gonna, change the entire Employment Standards Act, and we're gonna do it in 2 years. Okay? You're gonna come up against, for us, it's coming up against businesses, corporations. It's coming up against government that have not necessarily worked in the new world of work and don't really understand what it's like to work through a temp agency or work as a subcontractor or work as a self-employed worker or as a franchisee owner. I mean, these are all relatively new things that have happened. I mean, they're not new, but a lot of folks in government don't necessarily understand what's going on the ground. That's why we're there, right? We are the ones who are working on the ground. So it's our responsibility to effectively convey that information, but also not set the people up that we're working with to say, oh, we're going to do this and this and this, and we're going to achieve it within an incredible small time limit. And because people are going to get disappointed. They're going to say, what's the point of me coming to another meeting? We haven't been able to change the Employment Standards Act. We haven't gotten rid of that markup fee for temp agency workers. What's the point? You know, why should I come to another meeting? And people get demoralized, right? Because guess what? They're living in poverty and they're dealing with crap every single day. So how do you develop the participation in a public policy process that energizes people, that gives people inspiration, that makes people want to stay for the long haul, that makes people want to not just get involved, but get other people involved and have your numbers grow, right? And so it means really kind of looking at what are your outcomes of your public policy process. And this is not just looking at the deliverables and the outcomes in your grant that you've had to write. We have to have those conversations with the people that are involved in our communities, right? So let me give you an example. So in 2009, we had our first big experience with Bill 139, which was a bill around temporary agency work. So, so we, went to the committee process, and we had to, we didn't get 5 major things, and these were major things. But I have to say, my mistake was not realizing the major things. So I would be having conversations with everyone going, we're going to get this piece in the legislation, we're going to make it happen. And then it wasn't until sort of, after the legislation passed, and I was like, oh man, I can't believe we didn't do that. And then, someone said, well, there's nowhere in the world that actually has that. And did you really feel that you had the base for that change that you wanted? And I was like, what? You're saying that, joint and several liability, this is like some technical term, there's nowhere that has this piece of legislation. And here was I going out, saying to our members, saying to our allies, oh, no problem, we're going to get this, we're going to fight for this. Totally clueless, right? That, what I was actually sort of, putting out there, actually, no, we weren't. And so so what I'm trying to say is that we have to be accountable. We have to know what we're saying, and be clear that what we're actually advocating for has got some basis of reality. And if people are saying, well, why can't we do that? We need to say, well, you tell me, if this is not passed anywhere in the world, what do you think we're going to need to make this happen? And who do you think is going to oppose it? And what are we going to do to challenge that opposition, right? So I think it's having those really grounded conversations. But again, if you're only talking to policy wonks and researchers, and you're not talking to your community is going to get disappointed time and time and time again, because they're not going to see the changes that they want, because they're not part of the conversation, right? So I think it's really important that we talk about the long-term nature of the changes that we want. I mean, we talk to folks in the South, talk to organizers in India and different parts of Latin America, and the sense of movement building, and the sense that, of moving towards change. We're talking about 5 years, 10 years, 15 years of work that you're building here. Our notion that in North America that we can somehow just kind of get things moved and done with in a year and then move on to the next issue, it's not possible. And if it is possible, I would say, what depth does it have? What's the longevity of that work? And how is that going to build towards the next fight and the next public policy movement? How is that going to sort of continue to develop? So in 2009, we didn't get joint and several liability. It was not on the table. But guess what? In Bill 146 right now, that's in the books, we do have joint and several liability for temp agency workers. So 5 years later, through constant organizing and building, we have it right now. It just needs to get passed. But it is, it's a second reading, and our aim is to kind of get it passed, right? So what I'm saying is that, it's perseverance, it's the long-term nature of this work that we're doing. And we have to kind of see this as building blocks for the next phase of the public policy work that we're doing. Our minimum wage campaign is a perfect example. We are pushing for a principle that people should be paid 10% above the poverty line. We think that that's pretty reasonable, that if you're working full-time, you should not be living in poverty. Obviously, there are forces out there that don't believe that. So what have we won so far? We have won a 75-cent increase. June 1st, we're going to get 75-cent increase. We have won legislation that will now index the minimum wage. That legislation is at Queen's Park right now. So, things that we can build on and move. Is the conversation over? Is the conversation over around inequality? Are people still going to be living in poverty, making $11 an hour? Absolutely. Do we just walk away and go on to the next campaign? Absolutely not. People are still going to have to pay their rent after June 1st. So what is the next leg of the campaign? What is the next movement? How do you keep folks organized? Is the way to evaluate that campaign just on a 75-cent increase? Should we just say, oh, that campaign failed miserably? We lost it. We didn't get $14. We should just walk away, go home, have a cup of tea, and just go to bed. Absolutely not. What are some of the things that we've achieved? 25 cities got involved in our monthly $14 action, 14th of the month, every month we had an action. 25 cities got involved. People have gotten energized. We've had new people get involved in our campaign and in the Workers' Action Centre. We have a whole host of groups now that we're working with across Ontario that are now interested in working with the Workers' Action Centre on issues facing low-wage workers, and on precarious work, and on migrant work, and on minimum wage. We've had a massive debate about the minimum wage in our media. Right? We've had massive policy debates, conversations at the government level, at the political level, with economists, with unions, with anti-poverty groups about what should be the minimum wage, what about inequality, what should be our strategies, what should be our tactics. People have been debating this. It's been a topic of conversation. I think we can make it a provincial election issue. Because I think at the end of the day, the basic principle, that notion of raising people's expectations, that people deserve more when they're working, that is a good conversation and a good debate. That's going to help the next groundswell of the work that we do on that. Each are building blocks. So if we just evaluated it on whether or not we got the $14, we would just be like, yeah, no, we didn't do that. But if you have a way of measuring success and looking at small victories along the way of the public policy work, it changes your whole notion of how you are, first of all, setting goals for yourself in terms of the work that you're doing, but also evaluating your own campaign strategy, right, and your own public policy strategy. So, for instance, how many organizations have joined the public policy campaign that you're working on? Do you have new leaders coming out and getting involved and speaking to the issues? Do you have community media now covering the issues and paying attention? Have there been new people speaking at rallies or going to delegation meetings to visit MPPs? Could you get 100 people phoning a particular MPP on a day about a particular issue in their community? Could you get 50 people writing a letter to their local community media paper and talking about the issues that they're facing in their communities? These are all really hard things to get people to do, right? This all takes a lot of training, a lot of support, a lot of kind of skills building, and a lot of involvement in campaigns. Do you have, can you count 50 new people coming out to a meeting or to a rally? Do you have 10 new people getting involved in taking a leader? Break it down. Try to look at those small victories, but also make sure everyone who's involved in that campaign understand why those are victories as well. It's not just you as a person who's maybe coordinating it, sort of thinking, oh, well, that's really great. But how do people involved in the campaign understand that, wow, you know what, we didn't get that $14 raise, but what we do have is now a provincial network. So guess what? The next leg of the campaign, we're going to have a hell of a lot more support, right? We have a stronger base. We've got 50 new leaders getting involved. We have so many more allies who are saying, what do we do? How do we get involved? We have community media presence in 5 languages now. Before we just had 1. I mean, it's really trying to sort of think through how you build and how you understand victories and how you build those successes along the way. So the 4th idea is building community leadership, creativity, and constant evaluation into your work that will keep people moving forward and engaged. So I've talked about how just even the research process can keep people engaged. I don't know about you, but I really hate boring rallies. I cannot stand going to a demonstration or to a meeting where you have 19 people give their own rendition of a particular issue. It bores me to tears and it makes me want to paint my nails, which is something I never do. So how do we try to have some fun and creativity and some joy, may I say it, in the world of this work? How do we try to create events that actually kind of make people come up to you and say, I'm really going to come out to your next action. This was really fun. How do I get involved in your campaign? Not just because they feel obligated and they got 500 phone calls from you to come out to a meeting, but where they're actually kind of inspired to get involved in a fundamental way because they see that you're doing things differently. We need to, and you don't need a lot of money to do this, right? You don't need to write another grant. You just need to have some creativity and some people who are willing to think beyond the box. So for instance, when we were dealing with that, we found out that the Ministry of Labor was not going to, well, actually I shouldn't say the Ministry of Labor, the government, wasn't going to renew a $6 million investment that they had in employment standards. They were going to remove that. At the end of one of our organizing meetings, we decided to just create a little video. You know that Bare Naked Ladies song, If I Had $1 Million? So what we did was someone had a video cam, and everyone just kind of made up signs and said, okay, if you had $1 million, what would you do? So it was $6 million. So people just held up a sign and said, you know, if I had $1 million, I would make sure that we had more employment standards officers out there inspecting workplaces. Or if I had $1 million, I would make sure that people knew what their rights were. And so people just wrote their slogans. We just kind of had everyone lined up, and people just kind of, you know, with the backdrop, we got to get the permission from the Bare Naked Ladies to use their song. And we just made like a 3-minute video. And then we used that to highlight the fact that this was happening and to try to sort of get people to pay attention to this. The days of action around the minimum wage, we've had a lot of fun with these actions. I'll just give you a couple of ideas that we did. So Thanksgiving, we decided to have the theme around food. So what we did was we went to St. Lawrence Market and we basically cut up, I don't know how many pies. Tasha, you were there, right? Like so many pies. We did these, so we had people dress up as chefs. We had chef's hats. We had aprons, we had trays of pumpkin pie, and we went around the St. Lawrence Market and said, would you like to try a piece of pie? Actually, it's not a piece of pie, it's a crumb, because a crumb is what minimum wage workers get. They don't get to have their fair share of the pie. And people were like, you know, of course people were like, oh, a sample, that's great. How, I'd like a sample. And then while they were eating their sample of pumpkin pie, we talked to them about the minimum wage campaign. People signed petitions, they got involved in the campaign. Everyone had a great time. Another strategy that we used was when we launched the minimum wage campaign, we froze, the minimum wage was frozen, has been frozen for 4 years. We froze a $10 bill and a quarter in a block of ice, because this was in March of last year, and we delivered the blocks of ice, basically saying it's time to melt the freeze, on the minimum wage, and we delivered this to the Minister of Labour on a silver tray and to MPPs in people's neighbourhoods and in different cities. We also did things like, those big United Way checks when you do a big donor campaign, or if you're lucky to win $1 million, you would get one of those checks, which of course is a dream of mine. But we created our own huge checks of $5 billion, which we calculated with economists that would be the stimulus to the Ontario economy if everyone making less than $14 had their wages raised to $14. That would be the economic stimulus to our communities. And then we delivered those $5 billion checks to over 60 MPPs on November 14th, right? So again, people felt that it was a fun action. A lot of MPPs didn't know whether or not they should take the check or not, and what that would signify. And so it was, you got to have some fun. At Christmas, we gave out hot chocolate and candy canes. In February, we did a mic check action and actually went into the Eaton Centre and took over the Eaton Centre, and a lot of retail workers were very supportive of our action, and we had, of course, a lot of fun. Recently, we just created 16 massive styrofoam gold coins, loonies, to illustrate an action that we just had outside a temp agency. Basically, what we're trying to do is, how do you try to look at the issues that our communities face, have some creative actions that actually sort of bring across the messages, the ideas, the issues, but that people can actually kind of take in their communities. Because all of these things that I've been talking about translated to many cities across Ontario, giving out apples at autumn fairs, and giving people free apples and saying, let's talk about the minimum wage campaign. Setting up soup kitchens outside McDonald's, talking about the minimum wage campaign. Doing different leaflets, handing out pumpkin pie, many people doing Christmas carols on the minimum wage theme, dressing up as Santa Claus and elves and all that kind of stuff. And I think the thing is that people want to get active, they want to be involved, but they don't want to come to boring meetings, and they don't want to come to boring demonstrations where there's no energy, it's just speaker after speaker, and people just feel disengaged and disconnected. So, but again, I'm just saying this also, and I want to throw a caution that what I'm not saying is just do a whole bunch of media actions that have no depth and no substance to them, because you can go the other way, where you can develop these kinds of actions in isolation to communities, and where there is no depth, where there is no concrete policy solutions that you're coming up with, and therefore they just become kind of hip media events. I'm not talking about hip media events. I'm talking about a process that has depth to it, that involves creativity, but that ultimately is grounded in the communities that you're working with. Okay, my last idea, and I think I'm good for time, is how are you ensuring that you're analyzing power in determining your strategy, tactics, and overall goals? So, how do you understand who the key decision makers are in the work that you're doing? Again, another example is the temp bill that we worked on in 2009. After second reading, it goes to a standing committee at Queen's Park, where you have all three political parties on the standing committee. And obviously the Liberals were in the majority at that point. So we went and met with all of the people on that standing committee. But what we didn't realize is at the end of the day, even those guys on the standing committee, even though we got massive support from MPPs, at the end of the day, really, the Premier's office made the decision around what was actually going to change at that committee level. Now, if we'd have known that, yes, we might have still met with all the MPPs on the standing committee, but what we would have done is focus more on the Premier's office. So it's understanding how decisions are working, where the spheres of influence are. I also think that what was really important is that we understood that we were going to go up against the temp industry, big time. And so what we had done is, since 2003, we'd collected information, we'd collected stories, we'd collected contracts, we'd collected all kinds of ways in which violations that workers were facing were taking place. At all the meetings that we had at the Ministry of Labour with the ministers, again, a real educational process, but we had workers there at the table who could then speak to the issues. I remember meetings where, we would be talking to policy folks and where they'd say, well, the industry doesn't feel like that's an issue. And then we would have one of our members say, well, actually it is, because guess what? This is what happened to me when I went for a job. They charged me this fee, and in fact, this is how it takes place. And so I think because people were there at the table and that we had built the base for that, we were able to have some of those harder conversations and deal with some of that pushback. But we realized that we didn't have enough allies during that process, and we didn't have enough of a base to sort of really push the bigger changes that we wanted. I think now we do, but at that time we didn't. But it's, again, evaluating what's working for you and what's not. Again, we find that the Ministry of Labour is considered to be a junior ministry and not the same as some of the other ministries, which I still don't understand. But then who are the other players? Could be the cabinet, could be the Premier's office. Who are they listening to? Who are they concerned about? Are they really paying attention to folks in Toronto, or is it the rural communities or other cities that have more influence? And if that is the case, then how do you build your base in those other cities? Do you understand when key moments are, when decisions are being made? For instance, if you're waiting for when the budget comes out, and budget normally comes out in March, if you're waiting until January to put forward your issues, that's completely the wrong time to do it. It should be the summer before. So again, planning is important. Understanding when key decisions are happening are quite critical. And at the end of the day, do you have a base that you can then use to really push? Or is it just a lot of hot air and nobody's really going to come out, at the end of the day to support you? Who are you standing alongside with? Who has your back? Do people own the issue that you're working on? You can have the cleverest slogans and the best policy briefs and the nicest photographs, but really at the end of the day, do you have leverage? And and do you have a voice? And how big is that voice? These are just all the kinds of issues that we just all need to grapple with, right, in the work that we're doing. So I think I've spoken enough. I think I've thrown out a lot of different issues, and there was so much more that I could do, but I've tried to restrain myself. But I know that I've again thrown out a whole bunch of different things for you to think about. But I guess my first question to you in your small discussion that you're having at your tables is, when you're thinking about the public policy work that you're doing right now, what is a key challenge that you're facing when you think about some of the stuff that I've put out? And so maybe what we could do is spend a few minutes talking about that, and then I've got some other kind of questions that I think that we can work through. And if you're interested in, I can just walk about and be part of your conversations as well. But I think, one of the first things that we need to deal with when we're doing this work is kind of identifying maybe some key challenges and key barriers in doing the work the way we want to be doing it. And so I will leave it at that and leave you to have a bit of a conversation at your table. So thank you.